Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Anita Bennett grew up knowing what it meant to be present but unseen. From the outside, the Bennett name carried weight, old money, polished reputations, and a sprawling estate tucked away in a quiet, affluent city far from public curiosity. Inside that world, however, Anita existed like a shadow. She was Harold Bennett's daughter, but not the daughter the family spoke about with pride. She lived in a small apartment across town, worked a modest administrative job, and carried herself with a calm humility shaped by years of emotional neglect. While her cousins traveled, networked, and boasted of futures already secured for them, Anita learned to rely on discipline, silence, and self-control. She read in the evenings, volunteered at a community literacy center on weekends, and dreamed, quietly, of one day building something that belonged solely to her, untouched by the Bennett name. The Bennett family, on the other hand, thrived on appearances. Harold's siblings, nieces, and nephews gathered frequently, not out of affection but obligation and advantage. Conversations were sharp-edged, laughter selective. Anita attended only when absolutely necessary, and when she did, she was greeted with thin smiles and polite dismissals. Her Aunt Margaret viewed her as an inconvenience. Her cousins saw her as a reminder of something imperfect in their lineage, and no one ever asked about her work, her dreams, or her life. Anita learned early not to expect kindness from people who measured worth in assets and connections. Still, she never spoke ill of them. She believed dignity was quiet, and survival did not require applause. Harold Bennett existed somewhere between those worlds. He was a man of routine and restraint, deeply private, respected publicly, but emotionally distant even from those closest to him. He rarely visited Anita, yet he never fully cut her off. Their conversations were brief but sincere, focused on practical matters rather than emotion. He asked about her health, her job, whether she was managing well. Anita sensed that her father carried regrets he never voiced, but she did not push. She respected silence because it had shaped her. What she didn't know was that Harold observed everything, the cruelty, the exclusion, the entitlement, and he kept careful notes, both literal and emotional, about the people who bore his name. The call came on an ordinary afternoon. Anita was organizing files at work when her phone vibrated with a number she recognized but hadn't seen in months. The words were direct, professional, and devastating. Her father had passed away suddenly. There was no preparation for the way her chest tightened, no warning for the hollowness that followed. She sat in her car afterward, hands trembling on the steering wheel, realizing that whatever distance had existed between her and Harold, it was now permanent. Grief came quietly, without drama, settling deep and heavy. Alongside it came dread, because she knew returning to the Bennett estate would mean facing people who never believed she belonged. When Anita arrived at the estate, everything felt unchanged and yet unbearably different. The long driveway, the manicured gardens, the staff moving efficiently with lowered voices. It all reminded her how small she felt in that world. Her relatives were already gathered, dressed in black, exchanging rehearsed condolences. Some barely acknowledged her presence. Others offered sympathy laced with condescension. She overheard whispers about arrangements, assets, and what Harold would have wanted, spoken with unsettling confidence. No one asked Anita how she was holding up. No one offered her a seat. She stood quietly, absorbing it all, reminding herself that she was there to bury her father, not to earn their approval. As the days leading to the funeral unfolded, the family's true focus became impossible to ignore. Private conversations stopped abruptly when Anita entered a room. Laughter resumed when she left. Her cousin Daniel openly speculated about who would inherit the lake house. Margaret debated which charities would be cut off now that Harold was gone. Grief was a performance, and greed was the understudy waiting patiently in the wings. Anita spent most evenings alone in a guest room that felt more like borrowed space than shelter. She cried when no one could hear her, not only for her father, but for the realization that she had never truly had a family in that house. There were others watching, though Anita barely noticed at first. The family attorney, a reserved man named Thomas Green, observed quietly, saying little, taking notes. The estate manager, Eleanor Wright, moved through the halls with measured calm, her eyes sharp, her demeanor respectful toward Anita in a way that felt genuine. Small gestures, offering tea, ensuring Anita had what she needed, stood in stark contrast to the family's indifference. Anita didn't know why, but their presence made her feel slightly less alone, as though someone, somewhere, understood that there was more to this story than appearances suggested. The night before the funeral was the hardest. Anita sat by the window in her room, looking out at the darkened grounds, wondering if her father had ever stood there thinking about her. She replayed their last conversation, searching for meaning in his tone, his pauses, the things he hadn't said. Downstairs, voices rose and fell as relatives argued over logistics disguised as concern. Anita felt suspended between grief and resolve, unsure what awaited her the next day, but certain of one thing. Whatever happened, she would not beg for respect she had never been given. Morning arrived heavy with expectation. Guests filled the venue, a mix of family acquaintances, business partners, and distant relatives drawn by reputation rather than affection. Anita took her seat quietly, dressed simply, her composure steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. She could feel eyes on her, measuring, judging, dismissing. When murmurs started about her career, her lack of status, her supposed irrelevance, she kept her gaze forward. The service began, solemn and controlled, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. This was not just a funeral. It was a gathering of people convinced they already knew the ending. As the ceremony continued, subtle cruelty gave way to open mockery. Comments were whispered loud enough to be heard. Smiles carried sharp edges. Anita was spoken about as though she weren't there at all, reduced to an afterthought even in her father's farewell. She felt the sting, deeply and painfully, but she did not react. She sat still, hands folded, eyes dry, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. What no one realized, what they were too consumed by arrogance to imagine, was that the story they believed they were living was only halfway told. The burial ended with polite embraces and forced solemnity, but the moment the last handful of earth settled, the mood shifted. Grief evaporated quickly, replaced by thinly veiled anticipation. Conversations resumed with new energy, eyes bright with calculation. Anita stood apart, watching people who just lowered her father into ground, already discussing schedules, meetings, and next steps. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone else checked their phone. It struck her then that her sorrow had no place here. She felt invisible again, but this time the invisibility brought clarity instead of pain. These were not people she needed to impress, confront, or please. They had already shown her exactly who they were. Inside the estate, the family gathered in the formal sitting room, a space designed for power rather than comfort. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls, stern faces frozen in oil and judgment. Drinks were poured. Assumptions were spoken aloud without caution. Margaret spoke confidently about restructuring trusts. Daniel bragged about plans for properties he had never managed. Others nodded, already dividing a future that did not yet belong to them. Anita stood near the doorway, prepared to leave quietly. She believed genuinely that whatever the will contained, it would not include her. Years of emotional exclusion had trained her not to expect fairness. She turned to slip away until Thomas Green cleared his throat. The announcement was simple. The will would be read immediately, as per Harold Bennett's explicit instructions. The room stilled. Confidence sharpened into excitement. Chairs were pulled closer. Phones were silenced. Anita hesitated, then took a seat at the far end of the room, unnoticed. Thomas began with formalities, his voice calm, controlled, unhurried. Initial bequests were predictable: donations, minor allocations, ceremonial gestures. Smiles spread. Then the language shifted. Conditions were introduced. Names were omitted. Assets were reassigned. One by one, expectations collapsed. Margaret's smile froze. Daniel frowned. Murmurs erupted, quickly silenced by Thomas's steady tone. When Anita's name was spoken, the room went still. Not once, repeatedly. Entire sections of the state. Voting control. Final authority over trusts and charitable foundations. The air seemed to drain from the space. Confusion turned to disbelief. Disbelief to outrage. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Chairs scraped against the floor. Anita sat motionless, heart pounding, not in triumph but shock. She hadn't known. She hadn't imagined. Harold Bennett, the quiet, distant father, had seen everything. He had planned everything. And he had chosen her, not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. Thomas continued reading, detailing clauses that dismantled the family's power piece by piece. Their access depended on behavior. Their privileges were conditional. Their control was gone. Eleanor Wright stood calmly by the wall, her expression unreadable but resolute. The family erupted, questions, protests, threats, but none of it mattered. The will was airtight. Harold had anticipated every reaction. By the time Thomas finished, the room was no longer filled with confidence but panic. People who had mocked Anita hours earlier now looked at her with fear, disbelief, and something dangerously close to regret. Anita rose slowly. She did not smile. She did not gloat. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and quiet. She thanked Thomas. She acknowledged Eleanor. Then she addressed the room, not with anger, but with truth. She spoke of dignity, of choice, of how silence had taught her strength. She made no accusations. She needed none. The will had already said everything. When she finished, she walked out, leaving chaos behind her. For the first time in her life, she did not feel small in that house. The days that followed were relentless. Calls went unanswered. Messages piled up. Some relatives pleaded. Others threatened. Anita listened selectively, responding only through her attorney. She learned the scope of what her father had entrusted to her, and with it, the responsibility. It overwhelmed her at first, not the wealth, but the weight of intention behind it. Harold had not sought revenge. He had sought balance. He had protected her quietly, patiently, believing that when the moment came, she would be ready. And she was. Anita began making changes, not impulsive ones, but thoughtful, deliberate decisions. She met with advisors, restructured operations, ensured fairness where there had once been entitlement. She expanded the literacy program she had always supported, honoring her own passions rather than the family's vanity projects. She kept some people at a distance, removed others entirely. Each decision reflected not bitterness, but boundaries. Power did not change her. It revealed her. When confrontations came, and they did, Anita faced them calmly. Margaret demanded explanations. Daniel accused her of manipulation. Anita responded with facts, with documents, with silence where silence was deserved. There was nothing left to argue. The family that once defined her by what she lacked now had to face what they had lost. Some relationships ended without closure. Others dissolved quietly. Anita did not chase reconciliation. She did not need it to move forward. Eventually, the estate no longer felt like a battleground. It became a place of transition. Anita walked the grounds one final time, not as an outsider, but as someone who understood its history without being bound by it. She sold what she didn't need, preserved what mattered, and let go of the rest. She carried her father's legacy not as a burden, but as a foundation, one he had built carefully, even when she hadn't known. In the end, Anita chose a different life. She moved into a space that felt like hers. She surrounded herself with people who knew her before the name, before the will, before the power. She worked, she built, she lived. The mockery that once defined her family's view of her became irrelevant. They had underestimated her. Harold had not. And in that quiet truth, Anita Bennett found her new beginning. Not because of what was read aloud, but because she finally saw herself the way her father always had. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.